One of the hardest jobs of a journalist is actually to identify what is news, what is propaganda, what should be reported, and how do you treat this piece of news. And that goes from everything to the small things to the elections. You know, how much do you decide to cover these elections? How much weight do you give it in your bulletin? These are all very heavily weighed decisions that have an editorial impact. Television journalism has taken a turn for the worse, I think, whereby it's a lot about the reporter and the involvement of the reporter in the story, rather than the merits of the story itself. And that may be because there's been increasing pressure on journalists to churn out things that are more, if you like, interesting or sexy, rather than just rely on the power of the actual story that you're reporting on.
So many mixed reports actually in the last few hours, and you're getting...
My name's Sherine Tadros. I grew up in London, where I was born, for about 26 years. I lived pretty much in the same house in the same area my entire life, and then everything changed when I decided to take a job with Al-Jazeera English, and I moved to Doha in Qatar, and there began the whirlwind that is where I am now, which is living in Egypt, working for Sky News. Al Jazeera Arabic certainly created a huge storm when it came to being. The whole idea of being the voice of the voiceless, to present the other side of the story, this was completely revolutionary in Arab media. That's not what media did. It wasn't about presenting the other side, it was presenting one side very well. So Al Jazeera created a storm. It interviewed Israeli officials for the first time, and it became sort of the pariah of the Arab world in many ways. And it paid a heavy price for that. Their journalists always paid a heavy price for that. Al Jazeera English was slightly different. When it came on the scene, there was already CNN and NBC and other channels that challenged the governments and didn't have this sort of vested interest in one sort of propaganda. There was also a point at which it was the victim of its own success, and it was very difficult for them to stay one step removed from what the Qatari foreign policy was. And that's very unfortunate for the channel. But in essence, when you watch Al Jazeera English today, you still feel that they have this commitment to foreign news like no one else has. Resources that are devoted to foreign news that no one else has.
Gaza City in smoke. The Israeli military launched a series of aerial strikes against what it says is Hamas's infrastructure and security installations across the Strip.
Gaza was an extremely unique situation. When we covered the war at the end of 2008, what happened was me and my colleague Ayman Mohyeldin happened to be in the Gaza Strip when Israel enforced its complete blockade, closing its border to journalists for the entire period of the 3-week war. So what happened was, because Ayman and I were the only foreign journalists inside of Gaza, we were the only ones reporting for a foreign audience. That's not to say that there wasn't any reporting out of the Gaza Strip. There was, by countless number of extremely brave Palestinian journalists, but broadcasting in English, we were the only ones. So the effect of that was pretty huge. Firstly, because it was the first time that you had this sort of complete information blackout for the international community, what was going on inside the Strip during this extremely terrorizing assault that Israel launched for 3 weeks. But also because at the end of the day, networks could take pictures from Reuters and the Associated Press, and you could see visions, if you like, of 10 children on the floor. But what Al Jazeera did, and what we were able to do because we were inside, was tell you that this child, his name is Alex, and he wanted to be a fireman, and now he's dead. And this sort of humanization of the Gaza story is what you can do when you're inside. And it's exactly the reason why Israel prevented journalists from entering Gaza Strip, because it was a brutal assault, and to humanize it in this way clearly was going to be extremely detrimental for Israel's image abroad. I think the Arab Spring was an extremely huge challenge for every media network because people are used to one big event where you throw your resources at. It was extremely rare for you to have so many events. So it was a lot to cope for a lot of different media organizations that tried to cover one story only to find out that it was kicking off somewhere else and somewhere else and so on. For Al Jazeera, I think it felt that this was their moment. At the end of the day, Al Jazeera had been operating for 10 years in Arab countries, trying to expose those Arab regimes in a way that you hadn't seen any local or pan-Arab station try and do. It was poking at the side of every Arab country and their leaders and trying to hold them accountable to the people. So essentially, when people rose up against those regimes, Al Jazeera felt like this was its moment. This is what it was gearing up for. And it felt a huge part of what the Egyptian, Tunisians, Libyans, Yemenis were doing. And then actually during the revolution, Al Jazeera, like no one else, covered the sort of enormity of it and the protests and really took it extremely seriously from day one of Tunisia. So in many ways, when we talk about the breaking of the fear factor, which is what people credit the uprisings with, that fear factor could be broken because you were sitting at home watching TV, watching the Tunisians do it on Al Jazeera, watching your fellow Egyptians do it. So it was empowering that you could now go to Tahrir Square because you know how many people are in Tahrir Square. So in many ways, of course, Al Jazeera weren't the only ones covering the Arab uprising, but in many ways it felt like it was part of it, perhaps more than any other network. I think covering Egypt from the uprising onwards was challenging insofar as it felt like you were covering a war zone. So whereas a war starts and finishes, your average is about 2 or 3 weeks, Egypt continued for 3 years. And it exhausted not just the audience, but the journalists. And that exhaustion was very difficult for a lot of people, including myself. And it tended to lend itself to journalists being burnt out and making not necessarily the right decisions all of the time. I think as a female, the other main issue that I had working here, and I think what drove me away from covering the Egypt story eventually, was the harassment. There's a certain amount of harassment that all journalists feel and have to cope with on the street. And then there's a whole other level if you're a female journalist and the kind of attention that you attract on the street and the harassment that you get every single time you go out in different levels. On a lucky day, you will just simply get people whistling and shouting and trying to grab you. On a bad day, it can be a lot worse. As an Egyptian, it was probably one of the proudest moments when Mubarak fell, if only because you felt that for the first time people awoke. So it represented the awakening of a population and understanding that you deserved better. And I always remember the story from being in Yemen and interviewing this girl who was, I think she was about 12 or 13, and she was in Change Square in Sana'a. And I was telling her, you know, you've never known anyone else but Ali Abdullah Saleh. Why are you here sleeping and eating? And are you just having fun? And she goes, no, I'm not having fun. This is very serious for me. And I know that I don't know anything else but him, but I know that I deserve better. And so I asked her, why do you think you deserve better? Why do you think things are so hard for you now? Maybe things could get even harder later. And she said, because every day she goes to school, and on her way to school, there's a big garbage truck. And she sees little kids younger than her trying to find food from this garbage truck. And she said that I know I'm only young, but I know that that's wrong. And I'm here because I think that I can change that, and because the next generation deserve better.